Hello, it's just great to have all of you here today, and I'm pleased to introduce you to three master's degree students from UNC Charlotte who have finished their degree in reading education, like many of you. And they are going to give you a recap of their presentation at the State Reading Conference called Making Time to Do It All, Small Group Instruction. And I want you to know that we had over 100 people, standing room only, in this session, and you're going to get a chance to hear it right now. I want to introduce you first to Rebecca Lonan, and to my right, Jolene Graham, and to her right, Lindsay Merritt. Take it away.
Hi, thank you for listening to our presentation. The name of our presentation is Making Time to Do It All, and we felt as teachers that sometimes we feel overwhelmed by the amount of data that we have, and then how to take that data and turn it into small group instruction, and then how do we keep the other students involved while we're doing our small groups. So this is what I'm going to walk you through today. I'm going to start you out with a little bit of data. So we want you to think about all the data that you have. One example here is Dibbles, and we collect that multiple times throughout the year for fluency. We also have shown MAPS data, which is a state test that we're giving. And so you have these. You also have your common assessments. You have informal assessments. So when you think about all of this data, how do you organize it? So I want you to take just a second and think about the data that you have in your classroom and what you do with it. Okay, so here's a sample class for you. You have 10 students out of your class. Again, this is just a random sample. And we want you to think about, if these were your students, how would you group them based on only the information that we've given you here? So take just a moment and sort these, maybe talk to your partner about how you would sort these students into groups. So now that you've grouped your students, as teachers, we all know that that's not all that there is to a student. We know that students come with more than just their academic data. So if you take a look, there's definitely more to every student. Here's an example. So take a closer look at your class and see these more in-depth analysis of the student. And then look at the way that you sorted your students and see if you might sort them differently based on the data that you have now. So what changes did you make? So a quote here to share with you. So now that you have grouped all of your students and you have the data, you have tons of data, and you almost feel overwhelmed by it, this quote says, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." So all that we're asking you to do now is to take a step out with all of the data that you have and see where you can take your students. So it's not taking the whole leap and it's not making the whole journey. We're just asking you to take one step based on the groups that you have, and then see where they go from there. So one way to do this is to think about how data is more than end of year test. You have exit tickets along the way, you have observations, you have checklists, maybe student self-evaluations, conference notes, small group notes, and all of these are just as valuable as the data that you get from state test or more summative. So when you're managing your data, you want to be thinking about two big ideas. That data does not have to be threatening. It shouldn't be threatening. It should guide your instruction. So it should naturally come out of your work with your students. And talking about data with colleagues increases the potential for growth. And each teacher knows that sometimes it's not comfortable to talk about the data, especially when it's not the way you want it to be. And so it's important that you do talk to them. Maybe you find someone that you could trust, and you talk to them about your weaknesses and your strengths, and that's how you build the community of learners as well. And also, data does not have to be overwhelming. You want to think about what you want and then create tools to collect that information. So it does not have to be anything formal. It could only be based on what you need in your classroom, and it may not be duplicated in others. And then you want to let that data drive your classroom instruction so that it meets the needs of your students. Again, it's all based on what you need and what your students need. Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to Lindsay Merritt.
Hi, I am here to explain to you the nitty-gritty of your small group instruction. So we will begin with when and where and what does it look like. This is up to you as the teacher. You know what's best for your classroom. You need to first find a time that works for you. Keeping the same time each day sets a routine for your students, which helps them succeed. You need to manage the number of students that you're going to have in your group. This could range based on if you're doing a guided reading group or a strategy group, and we will get into that a little bit later. You need to have a set place where your group meets. In my classroom, I say, okay, Ms. Merritt's group, come, and they know to go to the kidney-shaped table. That's our space, that's our place to meet each day to do reading. And pick your battles. This is very key. If your day does not allow for small group instruction at your normal time, that is okay. You need to be flexible. You need to pick and choose what you're going to cover, when you're going to cover, and don't get discouraged if it takes a while to get in the routine of doing it. So, first you need to identify the type of reading group that you're going to be doing. Are you going to have a guided reading group or a strategy group? So I am going to have them pass out an anticipation guide, and I want you to look over it briefly, and I want you to decide if the statement is talking about a guided reading group or a strategy group. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to complete it, then we're going to go over the next couple of slides, and I want you to change those after our reading. Okay, so now that you've had time to fill out your anticipation guide, let's look at the different types of groups. First, we have guided reading groups. This is the group where the teacher is there from the beginning of the lesson to the end of the lesson. All your readers are at the same ability level. That means if they're on Lexile or DRA levels, they're all reading at the exact same level, and they're all reading the same text. Groups are formed based on your benchmark testing. Like Rebecca had mentioned, that data that you have accumulated will go toward picking your guided reading groups. Groups stay together for several meetings. Sometimes these groups can stay together half a year or even longer. They stay and rarely change. It just depends based on their reading levels. Kindergarten through second grade, they might fluctuate more frequently, whereas your third, fourth, and fifth graders, they might stay as a group for a longer period of time. In this group, you're helping students learn new text features, avoid errors, and build confidence when reading new levels in their text. Now, strategy groups are a little bit different. The teacher introduces one skill that they're going to focus on. They can do this with anchor charts, they can do this in closed reading, they can do it in several different ways, but they're going to continue to practice this strategy until it's mastered. They need to teach, model, and allow time for the practice. Readers can be at different reading levels. They could be reading different text. They generally take the text to their own seat and work on it individually and then group back up to review the strategy. These groups are not necessarily formed by your benchmark data. They're more formed by your observations and notes that you're making either from your small group instruction or in your other content areas. This is great for students who are established in their reading level, but they need a little push to boost them up to the next level where they need to go. Here's some things to remember in your small group instruction. Have a focus. Whether it is a strategy group or a guided group, you need to have a plan of what you're going to be doing. Students can tell when you're just winging it. So you need to know what you're going to be doing, what you want mastered, and having those essential questions, letting the students know what they'll expect at the end of this lesson will benefit both you and them. Link prior knowledge, whether you're working in a content area strategy or whether you're just talking about the books that you read yesterday. You need to link their knowledge. It's an ongoing process and they need to know where they've been and where they're headed. Book selection, book selection, book selection, especially in strategy groups. If you're doing a strategy, you need to make sure the book that the students have actually incorporates this strategy. Several times in my class I have the perfect book, but it doesn't quite meet the strategy we're working on. So you need to make sure you're reading these books ahead of time, making sure they're leveled and that they're appropriate for the students' levels. You need to introduce, like I mentioned earlier with Have a Focus, introduce what they're going to be doing, introduce the new material, introduce the strategy, or introduce the new level that they'll be doing. Each level has different things that'll be needed or assessed, so make sure you introduce those to the students. and keep at it. I don't know how many times I've talked to teachers at my school or on different grade levels, and they say, I've tried small group, it just didn't work for me. And I always ask them, how many times did you do it? And they'll say 1 or 2, but it was just too busy. You've got to keep at it. Once students are in a routine, they'll automatically know what to do and they'll come back for it. If I miss a small group with my kids, they're very upset and they want their time with me, especially if you teach at a Title I school like I have. This is your one-on-one time with them, and they respect it and they want it. So make sure you keep at it. Some ideas for small group instruction. Of course, you need to have a plan. Keep plans at hand to pull from. Keep your data and observations there so you can fluidly write, keep up with each thing, clear objectives stated for the students, and they need a follow-up activity from once your group ends. The picture you see is actually of a binder that I use in my classroom, and so I have my lessons there in each group, and I write my anecdotal notes as I flip through with each group. This is just an example of a small group strategy lesson I use. This is my lesson plan template. I write the student's name. Each strategy we're working on is color-coded because I'm one of those teachers that like color-coded things. So I know exactly what my objective is, what students I have, what they're supposed to take away from my lesson. My guided reading lessons look a little different. They look kind of like this. I document each student's reading as we go through. They're leveled in different groups, the blue group, the red group, and the green group. We have the text, since they're all reading the same text, and the objective for the lesson. Again, this is just an example. I know each of you will do it differently in your classrooms, and that's how it should be. It should be what fits best for you. This works for me, it might not work for you, so you just have to take and trial and error, see what works, and see what you need to improve. Another thing is to stay organized. I've noticed my students like to keep a binder or folders with their lessons and their plans. This is very important. If you can have your students keeping track of their own reading, my students have data notebooks where they keep track of their fluency, and they are so good about it and keeping each other accountable. So either you keep a binder or folder with plans or have students keep their own data. Either way you do it, it'll work fine. Make observations daily. I know I used to be the teacher that stuck sticky notes on everything, and as soon as I walked down the hallway, my sticky notes went flying through the air. So I had to learn really quickly to make a chart so I could write those things on it so I would have them there. This also is a great tool when you meet with administrators and they want to see your growth or your progress. You might not have that benchmark data readily available at that time, but you can show them your classroom anecdotal notes that you've been making in reading group, and they appreciate that. Also, you need to have a follow-up. Students need to take what they've learned and apply it. If they don't take it and they only do it in that one setting, they're likely to forget it. So, as you see on the board, these are some strategy cards that my students use. What we do is we go over the strategy. I make a large anchor chart, and then I make a small anchor chart laminated. On the back of the anchor chart is for them to write with a vis-a-vis or a Sharpie marker, and they get to use in their text the anchor chart, a mini version of the anchor chart. It's their takeaway activity. So we do it in the group, we go over it as a group, they take it back to their seat, they have it right in front of them, they fill it out, then they bring it back to the group and share what they got from their text. A lot of times this helps students hearing from others what they've learned, and it makes it click a little easier. And then there's just a quote. Reading furnishes the mind not only with materials of knowledge, it is thinking that makes what we read ours, which is very important because it goes right along with that follow-up. They need to know what they're learning, and that's what makes it theirs, knowing what they're doing and actually finding meaning in your reading group. Now I'll give it to Jolene.
So Lindsay talked a lot about what she was doing with her groups, her small groups that she's working with one-on-one. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the rest of your students are doing. So, for example, I have a class of 24 students, and in my class I pull small groups of maybe 4 to 6 students. Well, what are the rest of those students doing in the classroom that aren't meeting with me? So I'm going to talk a lot about the independent activities that those students will be doing. You want those activities to be tactile, visual, auditory, and verbal. So you want to make sure that your students have an opportunity to see something, to touch something, manipulate their centers or manipulate cards. You want to be able to hear something, and you should also give them the opportunity to talk with one another and have those discussions. You also want to make sure that you're organized. Like Lindsay said, those students know exactly what they're going to be doing week from week, and having a section of your classroom that's organized just for those independent learning centers gives your students an opportunity to know where to go every day and to know what they're going to be doing throughout the week, which leads you to structure your independent activities. You can see on the side there are different ways in the pictures that help you structure your activities. You want to be time conscious. So I have 30 minutes for my small group instruction. I want to make sure that I'm using my instruction the best way that I can, as well as the independent activities. I want to make sure the students are getting the most that they can get out of those independent activities. I also need to be conscious of if most of my groups are going over. They need that time in order to finish that activity to make it meaningful for them. If they're finishing early, I need to come up with a follow-up activity that makes sure that they are staying focused throughout the lesson. You want to remember to circulate. Even though you're pulling your small group, it's still important that you're walking around the room and checking in on your other students who are working independently. No matter how many times you give directions, no matter how clear your directions are, there's always going to be some sort of struggle within your independent learners. And the last is, it's okay to change. Sometimes you have an activity that you think is going to be the best activity in the world, and first day, Monday, it just flops. So it's okay to stop that activity, to change it, to rework it, and so that it's meaningful for the rest of the week and the rest of the students. And you can always make it up with that group in another time. So ways that you can keep your learners engaged during independent learning is through evidence of learning. So I always make sure that my groups have something that they walk away with. So those can include foldables, posters, worksheets. They can ask questions and get answers from their group members. Take notes using graphic organizers, thinking maps. They could do a video discussion. We use Educreations in the classroom where the students are able to write their learning on an app. It looks like a little miniature whiteboard, and they can video their responses through the interactive whiteboard on the iPad. They can go to a blog and write a reflection on a blog. Web quests or videos. We have concept question boards in my room where we'll come up with a topic. Maybe it's the unit that we're studying, like the moon. Students will be able to write questions that they have about the moon based on readings that they've done about the moon, and they can bring in concepts that they've learned through their own independent research. Here's an example of one poster that I've created to show my students. They came up with a question. It's titled, "What is the moon made of?" I'm sorry, my glue is falling apart. They wrote a paragraph, and then they added a little graph or a chart that goes along with it to show what they've learned and what they've read and the understanding of their reading. I also have some examples of foldables that I've used in my classroom. This is the Magic foldable. My students really love this. I spent one day teaching just a small group of students how to create this foldable, and then they in turn taught the rest of their groups. And it's really neat because, oops, excuse me, when you open it, it has a magic door. So we call it the Magic foldable. And then simple things like vocabulary books if you're working with context clues. So now that your students are in their independent groups, they're working on independent activities, you have evidence of their learning, you also want to make sure that they're accountable for their behavior. So in order to get these lessons in, to get these activities done, they really you have to have your behavior in check. So rules should be clearly posted. And we have an example of rules up here. Here's some examples I have of the rules we use in my classroom. They're really simple, they're to the point, and the students follow these rules in any kind of small group activity. One rule that I find really important is that you don't interrupt the small group. Even though I do get up and I do circulate among the room, I want to make sure that my students in my independent groups know that that's my time with that group and it's a special time. And so they're not just getting up to ask questions or raising their hand for questions that can't be answered within the group. You need to make sure that you strictly follow those rules without exception. So we all have those students who are very sweet and very innocent, and they might break the rule one time, and it's still important to let them know that those are the rules for a reason and that they shouldn't break them. So to alleviate some of those problems, we need to come up with ways to help students who are confused, if they have questions to ask, if they finish the activity early. One thing I do in my classroom is we have set routines so they know if they're struggling with an activity, they have to ask certain students before it comes to me as an issue. We also have hand signals. So if they do need to use the restroom or they do need to leave their seat to go to their cubbies, they have those hand signals. So I can just simply look across the room and give them the okay or ask them to wait until the end of class. And you also have to know how students are going to be held accountable for the work that they've completed. Is it going to be collected? Is it going to be independent work? Is it going to be group work? How are they going to complete that work? And then, like I've said, nonverbal signals, and then also to have a behavior plan in place. I have a clip chart. I can simply look across the room, say the student's name, and say clip down. They just get up, and then it's handled. And they know that each clip leads to a specific repercussion. So accountability and behavior, you also want to make sure your objectives are clear. I know that talking with Lindsay, she uses her strategy or her guided reading and strategy groups. The objectives are very clear. The students know exactly what they're to be doing, how they're to be doing the work, and what's expected at the end of the lesson. One thing I like to do in my small groups is I like to provide work samples. So the poster that I had of the moon summary would be an example that I would use in my classroom to show my groups so that they know what's expected of them. They also need to know how they'll be working. Sometimes for my independent learning, they're working in small groups. They might be working with their partner, who I've selected, or they might be working independently. And the activities and the work products that they are completing in those groups should be differentiated and should meet their level, because this is independent learning. They need to be doing it independently. If it's too easy, they're going to get bored and they're going to start to misbehave. If the work is too hard, then they might shut down, they might not complete it right, and it won't have any benefit for that time. Another way to do that is to provide rubrics. You can give rubrics to students on their product. You can also give students rubrics that help grade how the group has worked well together. And then also locations to turn in your work products. Because these are work products that the students should be doing and should be doing well and putting in a lot of work and effort, you want them to know that their work is being looked at, that it is helping you to decide which groups you are going to put them in the next week. So as we reflect on what Becca talked about with creating your small groups and Lindsay teacher pulling your small groups, and then also the independent small groups, we need to think about what evidence do we have that what we're doing is working. So are we collecting those work samples? Are we grading them? Are we looking at them and using that to create our new data groups? So going all the way back to Becca and taking the information that we have and creating those new groups based on the data. And then what are we going to do if it's not working? There's lots of times I have a great idea. Like, this is awesome. I go to school, we try it out for a week, and I've seen no improvement. well, what I thought was awesome isn't working. So I need to take that as a teacher and I need to decide that what do I need to do next to change that so that it does work for the students, because in the end that's our goal, is to make our students show growth. So I want to end with a quote. It's, "Education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today." And we wanted also to introduce to you our WIC. So Becca will do that.
All right, so now you have all the theory and the information behind what you do, so we wanted to give you some resources that you can go to when you're at each stage of this process. So this Wix will be available to you, and I just want to walk you through it, kind of give you an idea of what's here, so when you need it, you'll know where to look. So basically, this is the home page, and there is a list of apps that you can use. There's also information about each of us. And then each of these tabs is part of our presentation. So if there's a particular part that you're looking for, you can click on any of these. If you go back to managing data, there are a couple of the key ideas that we shared with you here. There are tips to remember down the right-hand side. And there's another list of ways to collect data, so you don't feel like you're always doing it the same way and using the same tools. And then there's also a link to articles that help to support the reasoning behind data, and then different kinds and different ways that you can use data to make your decisions. There's also a link to small group instruction. And just as Lindsay said, it breaks down the guided reading versus strategy groups. And that's really good to reference because sometimes they overlap. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting each of the students' needs. There's also a list of tips on the right-hand side, and then there's a link to resources for small group instruction. And you can hover over any of these. They have great explanations beside them, and it takes you directly to those links for when you need them. There's also a tab for independent evidence of learning, just as Jolene shared with us. And she has a great list of ideas here for ways that you can have your students show their learning while they're independently working. There are her tips and activities, and then there's also a link to a list of apps that we recommend for use during independent work. And then finally, there's a section on accountability and behavior. And after you have your small group set and your students have quality activities, and how do we hold them accountable, and how do we know that their behavior was also monitored? So again, we have tips here, and a lot of those were what we shared in the presentation. And then there are also a list of apps here, because the ultimate goal is for your small group to be successful. So just like Jolene said, if you're being interrupted or continually not being able to make your point with your small group, you're not going to be effective and your time was wasted. So there's also a link of apps here that can help you with classroom management. Any of these can be found in the App Store, and they're very, very helpful. We've each used these. So again, we hope that the information we've shared with you has been valuable at any point. I'm sure that you can look through our Wix and find things that you need, but we want you to have a successful time in your classroom and ultimately for your students to learn. So thanks again for having us.